Hello, everyone. Welcome.
And hello.
Hi, Kate. How's it going?
It's good. It's snowing, which I needed a hat today. So that's an excellent thing
Well,
to
we've
be
come to the
prepared
right
for this
place.
weather.
Right place for hat knitting.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm Daphne, and I'm here with Kate Atherley, who is teaching the Warm and Easy Hat. This is the second class in a series of 3. Thanks for joining us. If you missed the last session live, we're happy that you're here with us live, but do remember that the classes are being recorded as long as you're registered for them. So, and if you're missing that link, put it in, let me know, and I'll make sure that you get the link. And in fact, I'll put it in the chat here shortly. Just a couple of things I wanted to say before we jump right in and get to all the learning is that, well, first of all, I wanted to say, I hope some of you have tried your cast on and you're joining in the round and you're ribbing and you're ready to learn more today. We're going to go through increasing, I think, in the body and the length of the body and a few things about going above that ribbing. And Kate's got all kinds of tips and tricks for us again. Just make sure you're registered so that you do get the link and you can watch it again. I'll put the link in the chat. Put your questions, if you would, please, in the Q&A section on your Zoom screen, and that way Kate will see it, and I'll be watching it too and helping her monitor those questions. But in the meantime, just let us know in the chat, have you started? And if you have, what weight of yarn are you using? Are you using the super bulky or the DK or the Aran weight? And throw in what color you're using, because that's always exciting to see all the colors that everybody chooses. So thanks for joining us. I'll just turn it over to you, Kate, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the other side.
Excellent, Daphne. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining. And yes, goodness, we needed a hat today here in Toronto where I live. I was very happy to get this one out, although I had to make sure I didn't get it wet in the snow when we were walking the dog this morning. But yes, so the Warm and Easy hat pattern, and I am working with the bulky weight and wearing the bulky weight because it's the easiest for me to see with the demonstration, for you to see with the demonstrations, but also, frankly, it's the warmest for me here in Toronto with our nasty turn in our weather. So we're focusing on making this hat, and the hat pattern, as Daphne mentioned, is available in 3 weights. I'm using the super bulky. There's also an Aran weight and a DK weight. And so perhaps if your climate is not as cold as mine, or maybe you want something that's not quite so big, then you can be using one of those other yarns as well. And it works brilliantly in any of those yarns. All warm, all easy to knit. The thicker the yarn, the quicker it goes, though. You know, if you're thinking about knitting to a deadline, gift-giving season approaches. So in this second class, we're going to be focusing on making the transition from the ribbing to the body of the hat. There's some increases to talk about. I want to talk about working the body of the hat as well. There's a needle change, possibly, for two of the yarn weights. There's a needle size change. And I also want to talk about measuring the length of the hat, because this was something I really struggled with, honestly, when I was first knitting hats, was working out how to get the length exactly right. Because if you're just trying to measure it flat, you may not get a truly accurate measurement. So I'm going to show you a tip for that. Now, for this second session, what we need is we need you to have your second circular needle. For the bulky weight, we actually work most of the hat on one size circular needle, but for the Aran weight and the DK weight, we now bring in our larger sized circular needle. For those 2 finer yarns, it's good to use the smaller needle for the ribbing, so the ribbing stays nice and compact and it doesn't stretch out too much. And then we use a needle one size larger or so for the body of the hat, just so that the fabric is nice and relaxed and not too tight on your head, and it creates a nice look there. With the very large yarn, with that super bulky yarn, we stay on one size needle because, so here's the thing about these super bulky yarns, these very thick yarns, there aren't as many needles at that top end. And I found it with experimenting, working on one size needles gives a great result anyway. But that's the rationale for that there. All right, so, oh goodness, Hold on one second. Oh no, we're good. Apologies, I'm sorry. My Zoom just flashed there. I don't know if you saw that, so I just checked. I'm assuming you're still seeing the slides. Somebody please let me know in the Q&A if there's a problem with the slides. I had a funny flash on my screen. So what we did, what you would have done for your homework was joined the round and worked the ribbing. And for the homework, you will have, I hope, had a chance to work that ribbing and work the ribbing to the length that you want. And depending on the size you're making, it's going to be in the range of about 4 centimeters, about 1.5 inches or so. But we talked about this a little bit in the first session as well. You can make a fold over cuff. If you've got extra yarn or just need to be extra warm, you can make a deeper cuff to fold it over. And that is super come January and February when the winds are very strong and it's snowing even more than it is today. So you can make that good and long. Just check the pattern for the right length. And of course, this is one of these areas where there is a little bit of room for adjustment. You can make it a little bit longer. I don't necessarily recommend going any shorter because you want it to look right and you do want that ribbing to help the hat stay on and make the fit right. Okay, couple of tips here. When you're measuring the ribbing, measure the length of the ribbing on a section that's sitting on the needle cord. I will show you on the screen, but there's a funny old thing about the way the stitches lie when they're on the cord versus on the body of the needle. And if they're sitting on the body of the needle, that can distort it a tiny bit. So when we're working on a circular needle, measure the length of the ribbing on a section that's sitting on the needle cord. And we're going to do some increases. And before you start the increases, count the stitches. And just confirm the number you have compared to the number that the pattern told you to cast on. And this is where hats are a little bit forgiving. In an ideal world, you've hopefully got the number that you cast on, but things happen. And if you don't have quite the right number, well, this is where the hat becomes forgiving because it's okay. You can adjust. If we need to increase a little bit more or increase a little bit less, it's absolutely fine, but you just need to know. You don't have to tell anyone. You don't have to tell me. You don't have to tell your friends at the shop for knitting night, but you can just make a little note and adjust. Fair? And if you're working with the DK or the Aran weight yarn, you will need to grab your larger circular needle for this next step. Now, I see a question in the question and answer. Do I do a turnover row for the folded brim? So Patricia, this is a good question, but in this context, I'm not doing a turnover row. Sometimes when on garments and things where there's a hem, you might do what's known as a turning row or a turnover row that allows you to create a clean fold. With a hat, we tend not to do that because with the folded brim of a hat, it sort of depends on how much you want to pull it down. So you don't necessarily want to always be turning it at the same place. For example, with this one, I can turn it up a fair bit or only a little bit. Does that make sense? But in some contexts, a turnover row is helpful. Just I tend not to do it in a hat because it gives me more flexibility on how I'm going to wear it. All right. So what we need to do, as I mentioned, is change our needles as appropriate and work our increases. If you're working with the DK or the Aran weight, you will grab your larger needle and start knitting with that. Your marker is going to fall off. I'll show you how that happens. Just make sure that you put it back when you finish for the first full round with the new needle, which is to say this is a step. This first step is not something I do typically when I'm on the bus or when I'm outside of the house because I don't want to lose my stitch marker and I don't want to lose my needle. This is one of those things where I need to pay attention and count. So just we'll be keeping careful track of our stitch marker. Here's how the increase round goes. And if we're working, I'm working the bulky version. So I'm showing you the numbers for the bulky version, the super bulky version. Consult your pattern for the numbers for the right size and your yarn. So my increase round reads as follows. It says M1, and then I've got knit, a bunch of choices, and I've got a bunch of instructions here. What I need to do is I need to just circle the numbers for my size so I know which one I'm working. And here the instruction goes as follows. It says M1, which stands for make one. I'm going to show you how to do that. That's an increase. M1, knit 11, a total of 3 times. So that's M1 knit 11, M1 knit 11, M1 knit 11, a total of 3 times. Then I'll do another M1 and knit to the end of the round. These instructions can look a little bit intimidating because there's several different sets of brackets. So this is actually why I find it really helpful to just annotate that instruction by circling the numbers that are relevant to me. And if it feels a little bit intimidating to read, I just focus on the levels of the brackets. The round brackets here are used for the different sizes, for the numbers, for the different sizes. And the square bracket is used to indicate an instruction that is going to be repeated. That is one of the challenges, I think, sometimes with knitting patterns is the knitting itself isn't necessarily so bad, but reading the instructions can be a little bit intimidating. And when you've got multiple sizes and multiple numbers, there's a lot there, yeah? Always circle the numbers for your size. So here I've got to do M1, knit 11, 3 times, another M1, a knit, and I should end up with 48 stitches. So this is where it's useful to make sure that you have the right number of stitches, because you need to end up with the right number of stitches. And again, between you and me, the number of stitches you did the ribbing on is actually less important now. What we want to focus on is making sure we've got the right number of stitches for the upper portion of the hat, for the body of the hat, because having that right number of stitches makes sure that our finish ends up very neat and tidy. As I say, it's pretty forgiving and mistakes do happen. Keep track of the increases as you're working across. If you need 1 or 2 less to get to the right stitch count, you can just skip them. And if you need 1 or 2 more, you can just work them in the plain section at the end of the round. The objective here is to make sure that you have the correct number of stitches when you're done. Fair? So I'm going to change to my camera now, and I'm going to do a couple of demos because I want to show you how to do the increase. And I also want to show you what it might look like if we're changing a needle size. Let me get my pen here. So my instruction was for my size, make 1, knit 11. And I had to do that 3 times. I'll make sure that's in frame. And then I do M1, K to end. So I've written it down here so I can keep track as I'm working. And I'm aiming for 48 stitches. Now, I'm not going to make you watch as I count, but I counted before we started, and I do have the 44 that I was supposed to have. So that was it. That's a sigh of relief on my part. Saves me doing a little bit of fancy footwork. So I've got 2 things to demo here. Changing to a different needle size and doing those increases. Quick note on what I've got. I always put my work down. So when I finished my ribbing the other day, I put my work down 1 stitch before the end of the round. It was just so I didn't lose that stitch marker. So what I have to do is just knit to hit the end of the round. Here I am. And my stitch marker is going to drop off. So I'm going to set it aside so I can get it back. And I'm going to do with the larger needle if you need it. So I'm going to demonstrate what it might look like if you're changing to a larger needle, but you may or may not knit it. You may or not need it. Let's talk about what this M1 increase. M1 stands for make one, and we're funny, we're a little bit relaxed about that. Some people will refer to it as M1, some people will refer to it as make one. You'll hear people describe it differently. Here's how that goes. I'm going to write the instructions out for you once I've done the demo. We're going to use the tip of the left needle to pick up the strand that's running between these two stitches. It runs between the last stitch on the right and the next stitch on the left needle. And we pick this up from front to back, like so. And then we have to knit into that. Now, the trick with this is to make sure that you knit into it so it doesn't make a hole. We need to knit into it so it's twisted. So here, we need to knit into the back of this. What I'm doing is I'm taking my needle and I'm grabbing the loop there at the back. And if you find this is a little bit challenging, I'm a big fan of using my index finger here, my left index finger, to just hold this stitch down. Because it can feel a bit tight to try and get the needle into the back, particularly if you're changing to a larger needle. So what I do here is I will shuffle that loop down towards the tip. You see how I'm moving it? And I'm pinning it down with my left index finger so that I can catch through the back loop there and knit into it. And what that does is it creates a new stitch where there wasn't one before, and knitting into the back twists it so there isn't a hole. So that was my first M1. Then I need to knit 11. Now I've got several needle tips on the go here, and I wanted to show this to you. I wanted to show you what it looks like when we're changing needles, so that it looks. This is the wrestling a hedgehog stage, I think, of this. We've got all these 3 needle tips. I'm using 2 different types here to help me keep track of what's what. This is the larger needle that I'm knitting with, knitting off my smaller needle. And if this is in the way, you can just sort of push that to the side, because what's important is using the larger needle to knit from the smaller. I'm also going to write down here, so M1. So pick up strand. Not going to write all the words out, from front to back. And then knit through back. The instructions for this are in the pattern, so you don't need to necessarily write it down or worry about remembering it. But I always like to have that instruction handy as I'm going, as a reminder for myself. So I've done my increase. So I've done make one. Oh, I wrote it down in such a way. Let's keep this all in frame. I've done my first M1, my make one, and then I'm going to knit 11. I'm going to count off. Oh, look what happened there. Apologies. My needle fell off. You see, you won't be doing what I'm doing there, which is trying to keep your camera in focus, change pens and change knitting needles at the same time. So everything will stay on the larger needle. So there's my new increase. And then I knit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I know this isn't exciting watching me count stitches. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, but I wanted to do it just so that I could show you that increase again. So we use the tip of the needle to pick up the strand from front to back, and it's that horizontal strand that runs between the 2 stitches. And that's actually the most important thing to remember. Once you remember which way to pick this strand up, the second step is easier because you're just focusing on knitting it so it twists. Now, when I get to this point and this strand is on my left needle, I then think, okay, how do I need to knit this? Well, if I just knit it the normal way through the front there, to see what's happened is I've made a big old hole. So I know that that's not the right answer. What I need to be doing is picking this strand up from the front and knitting it through the back like that, so it twists and I don't make a hole. Make sense? You'll let me know if you need me to see me do that again. Maybe I'll do that once more for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I've done this twice now. I've done this make 1, knit 11 twice. So it'll be a third one. And again, once more for posterity through the front and then knit through the back so it's twisted. So here's something to know about this. When we use M1 or we use make 1, there's a couple of different versions. There's actually a right-leaning version, and then there's a left-leaning version. And there's some versions that are also a little bit more neutral. They don't have a particular right or left lean. So I strongly recommend when you're knitting a pattern, always check the glossary. Even if you are sure you know how a stitch works, it's a good idea to check the glossary to see there might be something regional in the way that they're using a term, or there might be something special that they need you to do particular to that pattern, right? And remember what I said was when we do this, we do it 3 times. Don't forget that sneaky last one, the 4th one. And if we had to do some extras or skip one, you can always do that too. Now I'm midway through the increases here. So you see how I've got 2 needles on the go. That's fine. It will sort itself out as I finish this round. In fact, seeing the 2 needles on the go here gives me a very good idea about something that might help me later on when I'm assessing the length of the hat. So does that make sense? If anybody has any questions about that or wants to see that again, see that increase again, you'll let me know. You can, of course, always watch the recording too. All right, so we go back to our slides. And again, the most important thing about this, the crucial detail is making sure that you have the correct number of stitches when you're done. Oh, and somebody has asked a question in the question and answer. So I said rather sort of casually that if you don't need an increase to get to the right number, you can just skip one. I just literally mean ignore it in the instructions. So just don't do anything. So it's sort of one of those hard questions to answer. Just don't do it. Too vague, right? Just where it might say knit 11, make 1, knit 11, just knit 11 and then knit another 11. Does that help? You'll let me know if you need more detail. Fair? Okay. Excellent. Now, the good news is it's plain sailing from here, because once you've got the right number of stitches, you just knit, 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 knit till it's the length that you want. I see a question about changing yarn color. I will do that, actually. I will do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to finish my increases on my sample here, and then I will show you how to do a color change. What an excellent question, Margaret. Thank you. So what we do, once we've got the right stitch count, and once you're on that larger needle, you really do just knit, 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 knit until it's the length that you want. And this fabric that we use in the body of the hat, we call stocking stitch. You may have encountered that in the US, and in Canada, it's sometimes referred to as stockinette stitch. They call it stocking stitch because this knit fabric is the fabric. It's the stitch we use to make stockings. And working it to the round is the best way to do it because there's none of that pesky purling. So it's quick, it's easy. And this is a very relaxing project at this point because all you're doing is knitting. You don't have to pay attention. You don't have to be counting. This is why I wanted you to be careful about the right number of stitches when you finished your increase, because you just knit, 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 knit. All right, how about we go back to my sample because we've had 2 questions about changing color. All right. And I'm also going to show you what happens when I get to the end of my increase round, when I've got my needle size change here. So I've started knitting with my larger needle and I come to the end of my round, and this is where I have to pay attention. When this comes out, I'm finished with it, so that can go back in my knitting bag. But what I need to do is remember to put this back, because that will help us later on. We actually don't need to worry about it so much right now when you're doing the knit, 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 knit portion. You don't need to worry so much about keeping track of the start of the round for the knit, knit, knit portion, but we do want to pay attention to it when it's time for the decreases. Let me show you how to change color. All right, so here's my second color. And Diane asks in the chat, do you do it on the increase round or the next round? You could actually do either. I would probably do it on the increase round, but that can add a level of having to pay attention. And if you'd rather just focus on doing the increases and then do it on the following one, that works beautifully too. So not too much of a difference there. All right, so we need to join our second yarn to change color. And here's how I do it. I'm going to do something that might make people gasp. I'm going to take my second color and I'm going to very loosely tie it around the first one. I'm not pulling this very tight, but what I'm doing there is I'm giving this, I'm attaching the new color around the old color, and I'm giving myself the ability to slide this into place. Do you see how that works? And then what I do is I'll just start knitting with my new color. I know that we've all been told that we shouldn't make knots in our knitting, but actually the prohibition and the concern about knots is that if you cut the ends short, they can come undone. But you'll notice I didn't leave a long, I left a long end here. I didn't cut this short. And when it's time to trim this off, I will also trim this with a decent end. And indeed, when we're finishing up, we may even just undo that knot. And that's why I didn't pull it so tight. But anchoring the new yarn around the old yarn, which is what I've done, make sure that I don't have any loose or sloppy stitches. Does that make sense? I find that if you just drop one yarn and start working with the other one, you'll get gaps and you get looseness. Whereas here, everything keeps tidy. Good question. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, from here, we just knit, knit, knit. See? Nice and simple. Yep. Nothing too complicated. And here's my blue one that I'm making, and I'm just going. And this was a fun evening of knitting in front of the television. And again, when I put it down at the end of the evening, I stopped one stitch before the marker, just so that marker didn't fall off. But what we have to do is make sure that it's the length that we want. So I'll talk about how to measure. Tape measure. And when I was talking about measuring, you get a much more accurate measurement if, again, this is a well-loved tape measure. You can see the numbers are fading away at the start there. You get a much more accurate measurement if you measure the stitches that are sitting on the cord rather than the ones on the needle, because the ones on the needle get stretched out a little bit and it can get a little bit distorted. It's not a big difference, but it's just one of those little expert tips. And you count to about the midpoint of that stitch, the row that's actually on the needle cord there. So I'm just about 12 and a smidge centimeters. Consult the pattern for the length that you want if you're knitting this as a gift. But also you can try it on, because the pattern lists how much space you need to leave for the finish. So it gives you a length. It says knit until the hat is a specific length, or until it's a specified length short of how long you want it to be. And this is how, what you can do is make sure it's longer, and a longer hat can be useful if you've got hair that you like to wear up in a ponytail or in a bun or a style like that, or you've got lots of curly hair, then you may need more room for your hair in your hat. And so you just want to pay attention and make sure that you're making it the length that's right for you. So you can try it on rather unexpectedly. If you're working on a short circular needle, it sort of doesn't necessarily come all the way down, and I'm concerned I don't want to stretch it out so much that I'm losing stitches off the ends of my needles. So what I will do is refer back to, remember when I said using a second needle here can be helpful? I'm going to slip some stitches onto my second circular needle, and this can be a smaller size, so I can just use my smaller size needle if I want. When I'm moving stitches around, I'm putting the needle in them as if to purl so that it doesn't twist them, so they stay the right way around. And I'm just coming from the tail, looking at the inside, and I'm going to pop about half those stitches on a second needle. So that I can safely try it on without being worried about losing any stitches off the needle, or without being worried about the stitch marker coming off. So here we go. So that's why when I changed to my larger needle, I didn't put this smaller one away. I just I tucked it into my knitting bag so it was available to me. All right, so I've divided the stitches up about half and half here. Doesn't have to be exact. And now I can safely try it on to assess the length without being worried about losing any stitches. There we go. What do you think? How does this look? I love this color. This is a good one. I'm looking forward to having a blue and a green hat. So I can try it on, see how much space I need to leave to make sure my ears are covered, and I've got space for my hair, and I can get a sense of how it fits and how it looks. What you'll do here, the way that I approach measuring this is as follows. This is sort of an inelegant demo. Do you see what I'm doing with the tape measure? I'm holding it from side to side and running it over the crown of my head, over the top of my head. I've tried to sort out an elegant way of demoing this. I really can't, but I hope you're able to get a visual of this. All right, I look at that and I take that measurement and I think, okay. That represents both sides. I need about half that length to finish up, to get to the midpoint. There's about 10 centimeters left before the top. So I'm going to check my pattern and see what my pattern says. My pattern says, let's go back to my slide here. My pattern says I need to work until it's about 4.5 centimeters shorter than I want. So I've still got some distance left to go. Does that make sense? So I'm going to knit until it's about 4.5 centimeters from the crown, the center top. And yeah, use a second needle to try it on. And remember, if you are making a folded over ribbing, starts to look a little bit silly, don't forget to fold it over before you try it on. Looks good. It's giving me ideas for a headband as well. What do you think? Might be a good way of using up the leftovers. All right. So I want to check in. How is it going for those who are knitting? Did you get a good sense of how those increases are going? What I want to do now is I'm going to go back to my camera. And finish putting these stitches back. So when I went to try it on, I split the stitches across my 2 needles, and it looks a little bit complicated at this point. I always just do a quick check with myself because I need to remember to put the stitches back on the needle they came from. And if you do, if you do lose a couple of stitches in that, let me show you how to fix that. Do you see how a couple have dropped off? We needn't worry. There's nothing to be concerned about here. When you're putting stitches back on the needle, well, what I would say is the first and most important thing is to just save the stitches. Put those stitches back on your knitting needle, and then we can determine whether they're the right way around or not. It's very much like if you, if you fall into the swimming pool, or you fall out of the boat into the lake, or if you fall off the jetty when you're at the seaside, get out first and then worry about whether your phone was in your pocket. So when I'm picking up drop stitches like this, get them on the needle first and then worry about whether they're the right way around or not, if that makes sense. A knit stitch, properly positioned, a knit stitch should be right leg forward on the needle. What do I mean by that? If I take this off my needle, do you see how the stitch has a right leg and a left leg? And for conventional Western style knitting, when I say Western here, there are parts of Eastern Europe that do something a little bit different. But Western Europe and North American knitters in general use a method where the right leg of the stitches sits at the front of their work. I don't want to get too theoretical here, but just to let you know why I made that comment. So for most of us, for Western style knitting, our stitches should be positioned so the right leg is at the front. And when I picked these two up, when I picked this stitch up, I got it wrong. Do you see? Do you see here how the left leg of the stitch is at the front of the needle? But that's okay. What's most important is that the stitch is saved, it's safe, and if it's the wrong way, I can just turn it around. Does that make sense? So these were the two that dropped off, and when I picked them up, so I just can look at them. So you save them first, get yourself out of the swimming pool, if you will, get yourself out of the sea, and then work out if you'd left your phone in your pocket or not. So pick up your 2 stitches and make sure they're positioned right leg forward. Does that make sense? So when I'm putting stitches back on my needle here, what I want to do is make sure that they're going back onto that larger needle that I should be knitting with. And so I'll find here the tip of the larger needle. And I've got two choices. I could do this end or I could do that end. But when you're moving stitches around, you actually don't want to be moving the end with the tail, because we need to keep that where it is so we're in position to knit. So I'm going to move from this side. Does that make sense? So I'm looking at the stitches that don't have the tail attached to them, so that when I'm putting them all back, this is why I said that when you're moving stitches around, put the needle in as if you're going to purl, so that that keeps the right leg of the stitch at the front. If inadvertently they get moved around, you can just put them back. So it's not the end of the world, just something to pay attention to. It's a quick old fix. If you knit them when they're the wrong way around on your needle, your stitches can just get a bit tight and they don't lie quite right. I'm putting them all back here. We call this slipping stitches purlwise or purlways. We're just putting them all back on my big needle, and then I can continue to knit until it's the length that I need. And so I need to do about another 5 centimeters or so to get to the place that I want. And I will often use one of these, or a little safety pin. I'm going to clip a removable stitch marker in, because this helps me keep track of my progress. I know that I've got about 5 more centimeters to go from here. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm looking at my knitting, it feels like it's not growing very quickly, or I've lost track. And to save yourself having to pause and measure every 2 minutes, if I put myself one of these removable style stitch markers in the fabric, I can keep track of my progress since there. All right, excellent. So for next week, knit until the hat is the length that you want it to be. Next week, we will be working on the decreases. And for that, we needed a couple of additional pieces of equipment. You need one of these clippy style removable stitch markers. A safety pin works. There are a number of different types of stitch markers that work like this. In addition, you need these double pointed needles. What these are all about is managing a small stitch count. Because as we decrease the top of the hat, it gets smaller, and it will get to the point where we have too few stitches to fit onto this circular needle. And the way around that is to use double pointed needles. There's actually different ways and different types of needles that work in this context as well. Sometimes you hear people talking about something called magic loop. What magic loop does is it uses a long circular needle in a clever way to solve the same problem. And the problem is simply that as we decrease, we'll have too few stitches to fit around the cord of that needle comfortably, if that makes sense. And if you've not worked with double pointed needles before, don't worry. In fact, a hat like this is the perfect place to learn. These come in different lengths. These are about a 20 centimeter long needle, about an 8-inch long needle. You can also get them in a 7-inch, which is about 18 centimeters, and 6-inch, which is about a 15 centimeter. And for the purposes of a hat, any of those lengths would work. A 15 centimeter, the shorter ones can actually sometimes be a little bit easier to handle. And you'll need a set of 4. Sometimes they're sold in sets of 4, sometimes they're sold in sets of 5, sometimes even they're sold in sets of 6. The bamboo or the wooden ones are often sold in sets of 6 because you might break one. So I think it's very clever, actually. It's a nice piece of extra security, having that extra extra needle in case you break or you lose one. But for our purposes, 4 is absolutely fine. So have your double pointed needles and your removable stitch marker ready, and your hat knitted to the point where we need to do the decreases. All right. So are there any questions about what I've shown? We made good time today. Oop. See, I'm trying my hat on here and I can't really get it all the way down because that circular needle is stopping me, but you get a sense of how it looks, right? And if you are doing a color change, we've got, I hope that you saw that as well. And next week, I'm going to also show you how to deal with the finishing, because we've got some ends. I'm deliberately wearing it with the end dramatically in front of my face here. I'll talk a little bit as well about creating some of these decorations, pom-poms and tassels and things. And I'll talk about a really important finishing step as well that sometimes gets missed or misunderstood. I think, did I see a raised hand for a question? If you do have questions, please type those into the Q&A. And that's the best way that we can see those. And Daphne, how are we doing for questions in the chat? Are we okay?
I think we're okay. I don't see any questions in the chat, just lots of thanks and great tips.
Excellent.
Learning lots and loving your analogies.
Yes.
I do too. I imagine myself on that jetty and like, oh, I never thought about that.
Yeah, exactly. Save the stitch, then worry about whether it's the right way around. I'm a pragmatist. What can I say? Because I know that mistakes happen. And this is actually, I feel like I've said this a lot. Am I getting a little boring on this point? But I love a hat because it is more forgiving than it might seem. And I know that when you're a newer knitter, it's, you know, you've got stitch counts to keep track of, there's increases, and that adding in that extra needle can be a little bit of a stressful moment too. And I think sometimes it adds up to feeling like there's a lot to keep track of and a lot of possible places where things go wrong. But honestly, in this case, this is why it's important to identify where we can recover from those things. And we all make these mistakes. And between you and me, this is where I make a confession. I had planned to drop a single stitch off the end of the needle. The fact that I dropped 2 stitches off the end of the needle, it happens to all of us. And so what's important is we don't need to undo. You'd be really surprised. There's a lot in knitting you don't need to undo. Like, not quite having the right number of stitches, not quite, you know, having a couple of stitches fall off the needles. There's so much that we can recover from. And that's part of becoming a great knitter, is learning to recover from those things. Because yes, goodness, I you know, someone said to me once that experienced knitters, it's not that we actually don't make fewer mistakes. We make more mistakes and we make them faster. So learning to be okay about the mistakes and learning to address the mistakes is a hugely important piece of taking your knitting to the next level.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, Kate. I really like the idea of using 2 sets of circulars to try on the hat. I'm one of those ones who's like, okay, what do I have around here? And I'll get out maybe a straight needle and I'll put that on a few stitches. And then that side of the hat is super weird, but I don't know why I never thought about just using 2 circulars.
Yes.
Great idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody asked to turn the slides off. So yes, so I've done that. Good. They can see me with my absolutely. Absolutely. Good. And I look forward to seeing everybody next week. And as I say, next week is going to be a good lesson on a bunch of different things. I'm going to dispel some myths. But for me, the main thing is, and let me just reach them and grab them here. The main thing is about making people feel comfortable with double pointed needles, because double pointed needles are the key to a lot of really great next step knitting, sock knitting, mittens, all sorts of lovely things. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing everybody. So, and Daphne, are there any final questions?
I don't see any in the Q&A or in the chat. I think we're all good. I'm looking forward to next week too. It's the last class.
It is.
But the all important decrease is really there. And I'm just looking forward to learning more tips and tricks from you, Kate, because I always pick something up. So thanks to you, Kate, and thanks to everybody for joining, and thanks for making your hats. Thanks for becoming hat knitters with us.
Absolutely.
Looking forward to seeing you all again next week.
Thank you. Oh, and before we go, I'm seeing another question in the chat just about the recordings. So it'll probably worth recapping how to get the recordings.
Oh, absolutely. Just make
Yes.
sure that you are signed up, that as long as you're registered for this. In other words, you didn't just click on a link. And I think if you're here, you couldn't have just clicked on a link. And what happens is sometime tomorrow, we send out an email to everybody who's registered for the class with a link to the recording. So at the very beginning of the class, I put in a link to the first recording. And then tomorrow's email will send another link out. They'll have a link to the first class as well as a link to today's class. And then next week, again, we'll send the link out to the third for the third class. So,
Excellent.
okay.
Super. Thank you so much. And please do bring your questions. And yeah, we're looking forward to seeing you, everybody, next week.
Okay. Bye for now, Kate. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
See you later.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.